This message comes from Capital One. The Capital One Venture X business card has no preset spending limit, so the card's purchasing power can adapt to meet business needs. Plus, the card earns unlimited double miles on every purchase, so the more a business spends, the more miles earned. And when traveling, the Venture X business card grants access to over 1,000 airport lounges. The Venture X business card. What's in your wallet? Terms and conditions apply. Find out more at CapitalOne.com/VentureXBusiness.
Have you ever heard of the English Armada? Yeah, me neither. Until very recently, I had never heard of an English Armada, but I assure you, the English Armada was very real, and it was a total disaster. In 1589, the year after the considerably more famous Spanish Armada failed to launch an invasion of England, the English made an attempt to strike back. The finances of the English crown were already stretched, given all the expenses that went into preparing the defense of 1588. But Queen Elizabeth was talked into further depleting the crown coffers to help England's favorite pirate, Sir Francis Drake, and his partner, Sir John Norris, build an armada even bigger than the Spanish Armada. Yes, when it was finally assembled and bolstered by allied Dutch ships from the Netherlands, the English Armada was the largest group of ships ever assembled on the Atlantic to that point in history. Now, the sources don't all agree on the exact numbers, but the English Armada consisted of anywhere between 140 to potentially 180 ships, depending on how you count. Now, I'm sure some of you are thinking, Sebastian, I thought the Spanish Armada of 1588 was the largest fleet ever assembled on the Atlantic to that point in history. It was, and then that record was beaten literally 1 year later by the English. The English Armada was to be used to achieve three important goals. One, destroy the battered Spanish Atlantic fleet, which was being repaired in northern Spain. 2, land an army in Portugal and convince the local Portuguese to revolt against the Habsburg King Philip II of Spain, who had recently claimed the Portuguese throne. Then, 3, sail off and take the Azores and establish a new base for English naval operations on those Atlantic islands. If everything went to plan, the English Armada might even be able to snag a returning Spanish treasure fleet as a bonus prize. Absolutely none of these objectives were achieved. The English Armada was terribly organized and saw mass desertions very early on in the campaign. The main objective of the Armada, to destroy what was left of the Spanish fleet, was almost immediately sidelined. The ports where most of the battered Spanish ships were being repaired were ignored by the Armada so that Francis Drake and his compatriots could plunder a smaller, less heavily defended coastal town. Even then, they were still ultimately driven off by the Spanish after losing roughly 1,000 men trying to storm a citadel in that city. The campaign in Portugal was similarly doomed. The popular rebellion that the English had hoped to inspire with their landing failed to materialize. They then settled into a fruitless siege and slowly started to starve before they were finally driven off by Spanish reinforcements. Now, the English did manage to brutally sack the coastal Spanish city of Vigo, but at great expense and loss of life. And here, once again, Spanish reinforcements arrived and drove them off. After that, the fleet was split. Francis Drake made a half-hearted attempt to sail for the Azores, but in the face of stiff headwinds and a sickly and starving crew, he instead headed home to England. Of the estimated 24,000 soldiers and sailors who embarked with the English Armada, between 3,000 and 6,000 returned alive. That means between 18 and 21,000 people either died or deserted during this mission. Now, accounting the number of lost ships is even more difficult given the poor quality of the records. Expert R.B. Wernham has determined that 15 ships were certainly lost, but it's likely that there were even more, with countless others damaged. A huge amount of English blood and treasure had been spent to achieve absolutely nothing. Now, why is this the first time that I'm learning about this? I mean, I don't mean to toot my own horn here, but I'm a bit of a history buff. Before I started researching this topic, I had never once heard of the English Armada. And it turns out I'm not alone. The English archaeologist David Wells once commented, quote, "The English Armada was larger than the Spanish, and from many points of view, it was an even greater disaster. This fact, however, is completely overlooked. It's never mentioned in the history courses taught in British schools, and a majority of British history teachers have never even heard of it." End quote. So why is it that the Spanish Armada is such a well-known piece of history, and the English Armada of literally just 1 year later is completely obscure? Well, I have a theory. The story of the English Armada complicates, dare I say, ruins the myth of the heroic defeat of the Spanish Armada. In that myth, Spain is guilty of hubris. It ruins it if you know that a year later, England fell victim to the same kind of hubris. In the myth, the Spanish Armada is impossibly huge, the invincible Armada, a Goliath to England's David. It ruins it if you know that a year later, the English built a way bigger fleet. In the myth, the English are plucky underdogs defending freedom. It ruins it if you know that a year later, the English were ignoring their strategic objectives to sack and plunder the most vulnerable-seeming Spanish towns. The story of the English Armada makes the defeat of the Spanish Armada seem like maybe it wasn't as big a deal as some overly enthusiastic Victorian-era historians might have us believe. But that's not to say that we can't learn from the doomed Spanish invasion of 1588. Understanding exactly why and how the Spanish Armada failed can be very instructive. History is filled with half-baked invasion plans and ill-conceived military adventures. The Spanish Armada is an archetypical example of a bad plan that gets too big to fail. Or rather, too big to be called off. But just because it's instructive doesn't necessarily mean that it's unique. And it definitely does not mean that the botched invasion of 1588 was one of the most pivotal events in the history of the world. What makes me so sure? Well, literally 1 year later, in 1589, an invasion attempt just as ambitious and just as disastrous went down, and you didn't even know about it. Can we take the defeat of the Spanish Armada off its historical pedestal and put it back in its proper historical context? Let's give it a shot today on Our Fake History. Episode number 199. Was the Spanish Armada a big deal? Part 2. Hello and welcome to Our Fake History. My name is Sebastian Major, and this is the podcast where we explore historical myths and try to determine what's fact, what's fiction, and what is such a good story that it simply must be told. Before we get going this week, I want to remind everyone that an ad-free version of this podcast is available through Patreon. Just go to patreon.com/OurFakeHistory and check out the level of support that works for you. You can support this show for as little as $1 a month. But if you want access to the ad-free feed and all the awesome extras, then please start supporting at $5 or more every month. The long-awaited Merlin extra episode is getting ever closer to completion. Thank you again for your patience. When that is finished, it will be available to patrons at all levels of support. The $1 patrons will get access to it. The $3 patrons will get access to it. The $5 and more patrons will get access to it. So it's a great time to start supporting on Patreon. I also want to remind everyone that we're still taking calls and voice messages to be featured in our 200th episode Call-In Spectacular. If you want to be part of that show, then either make a voice recording and email it to me at ourfakehistory@gmail.com, or if that feels too complicated, you can always call in to our toll-free number at 1-800-397-0870. This is last call, so if I don't have your message by March 25th, 2024, then you will be out of luck. I've been getting a ton of messages, which means I won't be able to feature them all. I've got to be a little choosy. Just wanted to know that I love y'all, and it's been real nice to hear your voices. Now, I will remind everyone once again that voice memos provide considerably better sound quality than the 1-800 number, so if you can do a voice memo, I recommend it. But as I've been saying, I will not discriminate against the old-fashioned callers. So once again, that's 1-800-397-0870. What you're listening to right now is part 2 in a 2-part series on the legendary Spanish Armada of 1588. If you've not already heard part 1, then you may want to go back and give that a listen now. In that first part, I started out by explaining just how inflated the reputation of the Spanish Armada has been in English language histories. Specifically, I pointed to historians from the Victorian and New Elizabethan eras who claimed that the defeat of the Armada was one of the most important turning points in world history. According to those historians, the English victory in 1588 kept the kingdom Protestant, saved the English ideals of liberty from Spanish oppression, and laid the cornerstone of the future British Empire. The thinking was that the failure of the Armada changed the power dynamic in Europe. England was urged along towards its imperial destiny, while Spain was condemned to an irreversible decline. The myth would have us believe that the stakes were incredibly high for the English, and that the outcome shaped the next few centuries of global history. I tried to let some air out of that myth by placing the event in its proper historical context. What I hopefully demonstrated was that Anglo-Spanish relations had a tumultuous 16th century. At times, the two nations were bound together by marriage alliances, while at others they were driven apart over matters of religion. The Spanish plan to invade England only came after decades of English provocations. This included Queen Elizabeth's winking encouragement of English pirates like Francis Drake, who were robbing Spanish treasure ships in the Caribbean. The English had also been quietly giving aid to Protestant rebels fighting the Spanish Habsburgs in the Netherlands. Things were finally brought to a head in 1585, when the English signed the Treaty of Nonsuch, in which they openly declared their allegiance to the Dutch rebel cause. The Queen pledged English soldiers to fight in the Netherlands and was given dominion over strategic towns in the Low Countries. As I pointed out, in the larger scope of the Anglo-Spanish War, it was technically the English who invaded first by sending troops to the traditionally Habsburg-dominated Netherlands. With that context in place, we looked at what the Spanish war aims truly were. The research done by historian Philippe Fernandez Armesto has demonstrated that the Spanish king Philip II's goals were considerably more limited than is sometimes claimed. The Spanish weren't really looking to occupy England for a very long time. They probably weren't even going to depose Queen Elizabeth, and they certainly weren't going to embark on the long and bloody process of stomping out Protestant religion in the country. If everything had gone to plan, the Spanish would have hopefully seized London quickly and forced Queen Elizabeth to sign a treaty that would end English support for the Dutch rebels, stop English piracy on the high seas, and guarantee the rights of Catholics in England. The Spanish would have also likely looted the hell out of southeastern England during their occupation. It's well known that the Spanish planned to use the Army of Flanders for this invasion. That was the army that had been fighting against the Dutch rebels and attempting to reimpose Habsburg rule on the parts of the Netherlands that had broken away. Even in the best-case scenario for the Spanish, that army was going to be needed back in the Netherlands if they ever planned on winning that war. My point in the last episode was that the attempted Spanish invasion of England is often presented as one of the great what-ifs of history. What if the Spanish Armada had been successful? How would the course of human events have been altered? Perhaps there would not have been a British Empire. And if there was no British Empire, then there would not have been a British North America. And if there was no British North America, then there couldn't have been an American Revolution. You see how this stuff starts to spin out of control? Now, of course, it's impossible to know what the counterfactuals could have been. But I've been persuaded that a Spanish victory in 1588 would not have been as world-changing as patriotic English myths would have us believe. This was not Britain's Salamis, as one Victorian historian dubbed the encounter. But we have still yet to answer a very important question. That is, why did the Spanish Armada fail? Were the Spanish simply outdone by plucky English sea dogs, or is there more to this story? Well, let's dive back into our tale and see what we can figure out.
With so many options, why choose Arizona State University?
For me, the only online option was ASU because of the quality. Their faculty was really involved with their students and care about your personal journey. The dedication to my personal development from my professors, that's been extremely valuable to me.
Earn your degree from the nation's most innovative university. Online. That's a degree better. Explore more than 350-plus undergraduate, graduate, and certificate programs at asuonline.asu.edu.
With hindsight, it's easy to look at the Spanish invasion plan of 1588 and conclude that the Armada was always doomed to fail. The plan was audacious. Transporting tens of thousands of soldiers through hostile waters and landing them safely in enemy territory is famously one of the most complex military operations one can attempt. Now, I'm sure the military history buffs in the crowd have a very specific definition of what constitutes an amphibious assault, but in 1588, this was about as close as you got to an amphibious assault. Essentially, the Spanish were imagining D-Day in reverse, a massive force taken across the English Channel, supported by overwhelming naval power that secures a beachhead and then steadily rolls over the entire country. Now, of course, this historical analogy isn't perfect. This was 1588 after all, and Tudor England wasn't exactly Fortress Europe of World War II. There were long stretches of English coastline that were virtually undefended. Still, pulling off this invasion would take a supreme level of coordination and a healthy dose of good luck. In 1588, both were in short supply for the Spanish. So, why did they even attempt this in the first place? Well, it's worth knowing that the Spanish had been on a bit of a winning streak, especially when it came to decisive sea battles. In 1571, the Spanish and their Holy League allies had scored a huge victory over the Ottoman Turks at the Battle of Lepanto. Lepanto had technically been the largest naval battle fought since the Roman period. While the Ottomans would keep a tight hold of the eastern Mediterranean, the victory had asserted Spanish dominance in the western part of that sea. Then, 9 years later, in 1580, King Philip II got deeply involved in what was known as the Portuguese succession crisis. After the unexpected deaths of the young King Sebastian of Portugal and his successor, his uncle King Henry, the question of who would inherit the Portuguese throne became hotly contested. So, Philip II, the King of Spain, pressed his claim, and the result was the absorption of the Portuguese Empire into Philip's already enormous holdings. This not only united the Iberian Peninsula, but also brought together two of the world's largest maritime empires. Significantly for our story, when Philip took control of Lisbon, he also gained control over the lion's share of the former Portuguese fleet. This was one of the most substantial collections of ocean-going ships in the world. The backbone of the Spanish Armada was to be made of these well-built Portuguese warships. But the ascension of Philip to the throne of Portugal was not a bloodless process. There were other claimants to the Portuguese throne, with armies who needed to be defeated. One rival for the throne, a man sometimes called Antonio the Resistant, created a base of power in the Portuguese Azores Islands. This led to a showdown between Antonio and Philip in the years 1582 and 1583. Philip would eventually take the Azores by force. The decisive moment in that contest was the naval battle of Ponta Delgada. This pit Philip II's fleet of Castilian and recently acquired Portuguese ships against a force of French corsairs, a handful of English ships, and Portuguese who were supporting Antonio the Resistant. The mostly French force was technically larger than Philip's attacking fleet, but it was the Spanish who ultimately won the day. This was significant because at the time, this had been one of the largest naval battles ever fought that far out into the Atlantic Ocean. Philip II's fleet had demonstrated that it could operate incredibly effectively in the big waters of the Atlantic. They had gone toe-to-toe with the French, one of Europe's other great Atlantic powers, and they had won handily. Now, you could see how something like that would make you confident. By the mid-1580s, Philip II was commanding the combined naval might of Spain and Portugal. Over the course of a decade, his fleet had bested some truly formidable adversaries. One of the men who had commanded Philip II's victorious fleet in the Azores was a Spanish aristocrat known as the Marquess of Santa Cruz. The Marquess was a key military advisor to the king for many years, and he had been one of the most hawkish voices at court when it came to the English. He had been advocating taking the fight to Queen Elizabeth for quite some time. When the English signed the Treaty of Nonsuch, publicly aligning themselves with the Dutch rebels, Philip was finally ready to hear Santa Cruz out. So he asked him for a plan to invade England. Santa Cruz returned with a pretty wild proposal. The king should assemble a fleet of more than 550 ships, including 156 great ships of war manned by roughly 30,000 sailors. This massive armada would transport an army of 64,000 soldiers directly to England's shores. The original Santa Cruz plan was quite simple. The army would be transported directly from Spain to England. The massive fleet would easily push aside any naval resistance. The army would then disembark at a lightly defended spot on the English coast. Once the well-trained Spanish army had landed, they surely would make quick work of the hodgepodge of hastily mustered English defenders. But here's the thing. Both the army and the fleet imagined by Santa Cruz were impossibly huge. In the end, the Spanish Armada would number roughly 130 ships, and that was the largest single collection of ships ever on the Atlantic. The largest fleet ever to that point in history was a quarter of what Santa Cruz wanted. Many historians have actually found this to be a little suspicious. Historian Phillip Fernandez Armesto explains, quote, "The Phantom Armada of Santa Cruz was so impossibly vast that many historians have supposed that it cannot seriously have been intended. The Marquess, it is argued, must have lost confidence in his enterprise of England and set his demands unacceptably high in order to get his project shelved without a loss of face." End quote. I find that interpretation fascinating. It's possible that the biggest war hawk when it came to the English realized that trying to invade England was actually a bad idea. But instead of going, "Your Majesty, I may have been overzealous before in my approach to England," he tries to save face by proposing a plan he thinks will be rejected. But instead of simply rejecting the plan out of hand, King Philip went looking for a second opinion. Specifically, he asked the man in charge of the Army of Flanders how he would go about invading England. This was a fellow styled the Duke of Parma. And Parma is going to be a big part of our story here, so remember that, the Duke of Parma. He was a Habsburg-aligned nobleman who had been commanding the force tasked with ending the Dutch revolt for several years. The Duke of Parma took the Santa Cruz plan and made some tweaks. First, he told the King of Spain that he didn't really need to raise an all-new army. He just needed to reinforce the existing Army of Flanders. Then a portion of that battle-tested veteran force could be diverted to England. In Parma's original plan, the Armada was going to be used as a diversion. The giant fleet would sail in and threaten an English port city like Plymouth or Portsmouth. This would hopefully engage the English fleet. Meanwhile, around 30,000 soldiers from the Army of Flanders would make a fast dash across the English Channel from the Netherlands in shallow draft transport vessels that he would have constructed specifically for the purpose. This plan was attractive because the Armada didn't need to be as impossibly huge as the original Santa Cruz plan, and Philip II could use an army that he already had in the field. But this plan could only be successful if the entire operation was kept top secret. If the English had any inkling that the Armada was a feint and that the real force was crossing from the Netherlands, the whole plan could be a huge disaster. If even a portion of the English fleet ignored the Armada and attacked the unarmed transports, the Army of Flanders would quickly find itself at the bottom of the ocean. So this plan had a fatal flaw, and it seems like Parma knew it. keeping the crossing of 30,000 soldiers a secret in 1588 was basically impossible. Even if a tight lid was kept on everything and the English fleet was distracted, the coast was still filled with Dutch marauders who would have loved to find the lion's share of the Army of Flanders bobbing along undefended in the Channel. Some historians believe that Parma understood this flaw and, like Santa Cruz, had proposed a plan that he hoped would never go forward. Again, Fernandez Armesto explains, quote, "It has been suggested that Parma's real motives were revealed in the early part of the memorandum, which called for his forces to be brought up to strength. And, for want of secrecy, the invasion force might have to stay in Flanders. By this interpretation, Parma was exploiting the king's enthusiasm for the Armada project to extort reinforcements that could be used in the Low Countries." End quote. So, we have a strange situation where the two main architects of the Spanish Armada plan weren't really serious when they created the plan. The Marquess of Santa Cruz was likely trying to save face by proposing something ridiculous, and the Duke of Parma likely proposed an intentionally flawed plan so he could get some reinforcements. Neither man fully appreciated just how set the King of Spain was on taking the fight to England. And King Philip II liked the Duke of Parma's plan. So he set about assembling the largest armada the Atlantic had ever seen to make it a reality. Now, one of the reasons historians like Felipe Fernandez Armesto think that the Duke of Parma's original plan was never seriously intended is that the Duke very quickly changed his tune about the plan as soon as it became clear that the king was seriously going to attempt to invade England with the Army of Flanders. So the Duke started sending letters saying that he didn't think that there was any possible way that they could keep this invasion a secret. If His Majesty was set on using the Army of Flanders, then they really shouldn't cross the Channel undefended. So the Duke of Parma insisted that they change the plan. The Armada was needed to protect and escort the army while they crossed the Channel. In the revised plan, the Armada was going to head to the English Channel, rendezvous with Parma and his troops, and then it would guard the transport vessels as they made their crossing. It was also decided that Parma would only commit 17,000 troops from the Army of Flanders. Another 17,000 would sail with the Armada from Spain. So, this was the final plan. It was a bad plan that no one liked. It was a compromise between two already unrealistic strategies. It also sacrificed the two elements that made the original plans attractive. Santa Cruz's unstoppable, overwhelming force was pared down, and Parma's feint and surprise landing was completely jettisoned. The new plan relied on a level of coordination between a naval force and a ground force that was basically unprecedented in the 16th century. For this to work, the timing needed to be impeccable. Parma and his 17,000 soldiers needed to be ready to embark right when the Armada arrived, or the chances of success plummeted. The communication between the Army of Flanders and the Spanish Armada needed to be perfect. And remember, the communication system we're dealing with in 1588 is letters being sent by boat. The weather would need to be just right. Bad winds or a storm could completely ruin it. And the English fleet needed to react in a way that was simultaneously predictable and incompetent. It was a bad plan. So why did the Spanish go through with it? Well, part of it simply was momentum. Once the king decided in 1585 that the Armada would be assembled, that set in motion a massive and expensive process. Now, one of the common misconceptions about the Spanish Armada is that it needed to be built from scratch. There's even an old legend that the Spanish completely deforested their country in the quest to build the Armada. That is totally untrue. In fact, the vast majority of the ships that comprised the Armada were already constructed in 1585. The Armada was created by gathering together ships from all different corners of the empire in Lisbon. As I already said, the warships of the former Portuguese navy formed its core. These were supplemented by some of the best ships from the Castilian navy. Ships were brought in from the Mediterranean, including galleys and galleasses, which were primarily road vessels. Ships were also called back from the Caribbean. The Armada was a patchwork of different types of vessels that truly represented the scope of the Spanish Empire at the time. From there, merchant vessels were commandeered and were outfitted for war. This might seem a little strange to a modern observer, but this was quite common in the 16th century. Back then, the differences between a merchant ship and a warship were not as marked as they are now. At full strength, the Armada numbered 130 ships, but 30 of those were small craft that displaced under 100 tons. The Portuguese galleons at the core of the fleet were among the best constructed ships in the world at the time. So the issue wasn't building the ships, it was properly arming and provisioning the fleet. The merchantmen all needed guns. The whole fleet needed powder and shot. One of the biggest logistical hurdles was just getting the food that was required to feed the tens of thousands of soldiers and sailors on board the Armada. The process of requisitioning that amount of food from a society that was still essentially medieval in its structure was a complicated and slow process, and meant dealing with countless local lords and dignitaries, each of whom had been guaranteed his own complicated web of rights and privileges. Once those guys had been satisfied and they had squeezed the local peasantry for the needed food, you then had to make sure that that food didn't rot before it could get into the mouths of the sailors and the soldiers that needed to eat it. Now, this is hard to do in modern times with refrigeration technology. So imagine 1588. And the food was just one piece of the puzzle. With that in mind, it becomes a little easier to see how difficult it would have been to cancel this enterprise once preparations were underway. This thing had a momentum all its own. Once Philip II had committed to the so-called English enterprise, he was more open to suggestions about modifying the plan than simply canceling it and wasting so many resources. The king also seems to have leaned on his faith to help him brush aside the growing chorus of concerns from his commanders. When concerns about the success of the enterprise were raised, the king would often assure his nervous commanders that God was on their side. He said on one occasion, quote, "This is a matter guided by his hand, and he, that is God, will help you." End quote. On another occasion, he acknowledged the immense challenges faced in assembling the Armada and the near impossibility of the task ahead by confidently telling his commanders, quote, "I hope that our Lord will turn all these hardships which we are encountering at the beginning into his greater glory at the end." End quote. It didn't help that in February of 1588, just a few months before the fleet was set to launch, the Marquess of Santa Cruz died. Not only had he been overseeing the entire project of assembling the Armada, but he had been one of the most successful admirals in Spanish maritime history. They felt his loss. Command of the Armada was given to the Duke of Medina Sidonia, who made his own misgivings about the odds of success well known to the king. But Philip II had made up his mind on the matter. Too much money, energy, and political capital had already been spent on this enterprise. And Philip was exactly the kind of person to put the rest in God's hands. Still, despite all the difficulties, the Spanish had managed to assemble a massive fleet that included some of the largest warships at sea in the late 16th century. It wasn't nothing. But when the Armada embarked from Lisbon in late May of 1588, one of the senior commanders, Don Martin de Bertendona, admitted that they were sailing, quote, in the confident hope of a miracle, end quote. Despite having the largest fleet in the world, for this to work, the Spanish would need divine intervention. So, let's pause here, and when we return, we'll look at how the English responded to this threat. When the Spanish Armada was sighted off the coast of Cornwall on July 29, 1588, the English were ready. Well, they were kinda ready. As the Duke of Parma had worried, an attempted invasion on such a grand scale was a very hard thing to keep secret. The English intelligence was spotty and incomplete, but they had known for years that a massive fleet was being assembled in Lisbon. And there was good reason to suspect that the Spanish may be planning to invade using the Army of Flanders. But beyond that, the English didn't know much else. Now, this was partially because even the Spanish were a little hazy on how the details of this thing were going to work. Still, the English had been on a war footing since 1585. After signing the Treaty of Nonsuch and open conflict with Spain looked likely, Queen Elizabeth essentially let her pirates off the chain. Sir Francis Drake was given a royal blessing to cause havoc in the Caribbean. Now, he was still technically operating as an independent pirate, but it was clear that he was now helping forward English military objectives as well as enriching himself. With a pirate fleet of 25 ships, he sacked and looted the Spanish colonial cities of Santo Domingo and Cartagena, as well as raiding the fledgling Florida colony of St. Augustine. When he returned to England, Drake was given orders by the Queen to sail to Spain and disrupt Spanish shipbuilding as best he could. Now, interestingly, Queen Elizabeth actually had second thoughts about this, because this was truly an unambiguous act of war. She technically canceled the orders in a letter that was sent to Drake. But Francis Drake caught wind of the fact that the Queen was waffling, and he got worried that he might miss a chance to do some quasi-legitimate plundering. So, being a good pirate, he quickly put to sea before Elizabeth's letter could arrive. This, of course, gave him plausible deniability. He didn't know that the plan was canceled. He was just so eager to get out there and serve his queen. Gotta love this guy. In April of 1587, Drake launched a surprise attack on the Spanish port of Cadiz, the second most important staging area for the Armada after Lisbon. He was able to sink 24 ships anchored in the outer harbor. He then captured the Portuguese town of Sagres and disrupted all Spanish movement between the two key ports of Lisbon and Cadiz for a solid month. On his journey home via the Azores, Drake just missed the chance to attack the Spanish treasure fleet, but managed to loot one struggling galleon loaded with silver and gold from Central America. The whole adventure was classic El Drac, risky, violent, and surprisingly successful. The exploit would be remembered fondly in England as Drake, quote, singeing the King of Spain's beard, end quote. It likely set back the embarkation of the Spanish Armada by a solid year. This bought the English some much-needed time to beef up their navy, and beef it up they did. This brings me to one of the most enduring myths about the conflict with the Spanish Armada. This is the idea that this clash was a David versus Goliath type struggle. Now, if you're comparing the relative size and strength of the Spanish and English empires, then yes, in 1588, Spain truly was a Goliath compared to England. You've noticed that I've been very careful to say England and not Britain here. That's because Britain as a political entity didn't exist in 1588. During the reign of Queen Elizabeth I, Scotland was an independent kingdom. So when you consider the relative size of the English holdings, then you could say that England was an underdog in this fight. However, as soon as you start comparing the fleets, the David and Goliath comparisons become a little ridiculous. The myth of the Spanish Armada was that it was an impossibly huge collection of ships, and it was big, but it was only just a little bit bigger than the English fleet in 1588. Remember, the Spanish Armada consisted of 130 ships that sailed from Lisbon. Of those 130 vessels, around 25 were ships known as hulks. These were large, slow-moving ships that were being used to transport Spanish troops and act as supply vessels for the fleet. So that means that around 105 ships were properly fitted for battle. Now, how many ships did the English have? 105. And because the English were operating close to friendly ports, most of those ships were fitted to fight. Like the Spanish fleet, many of those English ships were merchantmen who had only been recently outfitted with guns. But importantly, the English fleet didn't have a massive group of slow-moving transport hulks. So, from that perspective, the fleets were about even. As it would turn out, the English ships also had an advantage when it came to firepower. The English had developed four-wheeled carriages for the cannon that they had aboard their ships. They also had a clever block and tackle mechanism that helped them move the guns around with less effort. The Spanish were still using two-wheeled carriages that were so cumbersome that their guns were basically stationary. The English gun carriages and the pulley systems meant that their guns could be pulled closer to the gun ports, which gave them greater range. They could also be quickly repositioned and more quickly reloaded. The greater range and quicker reload time was a huge advantage against the Spanish, who favored a style of naval combat that involved getting close to an enemy ship and boarding it. If you could harass a Spanish ship from a distance, that was a good thing. So while the Spanish possessed large, sturdy galleons bigger than anything in the English fleet, the innovations of English gunnery truly leveled the playing field. At sea, this was a match of equals. On land, things were entirely different. The English land defenses were kind of a confused mess. There were competing ideas about the best way to deploy the regular soldiers, who would then be supplemented by militias raised from the local English people. In England, One of the most romantic images associated with the approach of the Spanish Armada is the lighting of the beacons. The English had set up a series of warning beacons along the south shore of the country. The idea was very simple. If an enemy force was spotted off the coast, a beacon placed on a local hill would be set aflame. That flame would be visible to the keeper of the next beacon, who would then set his on fire. The chain reaction would continue until the news of an approaching fleet reached London. If you've seen Lord of the Rings, you get the idea. They had the same system in Gondor. The beacons were also there to inform the civilian militia that the time had come to gather arms and meet at the muster point. In many patriotic poems and paintings that followed 1588, the blazing beacons were always a standard part of the imagery. The nationalistic myth was, of course, that as soon as the beacons were lit, patriotic Englishmen dropped their plows, grabbed their pikes, and rushed to defend their country. The reality was considerably less romantic. In this period, the English militias were in a pretty sad state. The people were barely trained and poorly organized. It didn't help that England's aristocratic war leaders had open contempt for the lower-class irregular troops. When the beacons were lit, country militias were supposed to follow the fleet along the coast. Very few actually did this. Many of the farmer warriors simply returned to their homes after the fleet was out of sight. Other militiamen who had been mustered in Wales and the English Midlands were just as unenthusiastic about fighting the Spanish. Thousands of militiamen deserted before they joined up with the main army groups in London and Tilbury. So, when it came to the lighting of the beacons, the English response was a bit of a mixed bag. If the Spanish had managed to land their troops in England, it's very likely that they would have rolled over the English defenders. The Habsburg forces were the best trained in Europe, and the Army of Flanders was a force of veterans. If it had come to a land battle, then the disparities between the two sides would have really become apparent. But, famously, it did not come to that. The English fleet was formidable, and it was commanded by independent-minded but ultimately competent sailors. The Lord High Admiral was the venerable Charles Howard of Effingham, but his vice-admirals were a collection of some of England's most notorious sea dogs. Chief among them was the notorious slaver John Hawkins, England's #1 pirate Francis Drake, and the storied English explorer Martin Frobisher. Frobisher is a name that has a particular resonance with me as a Canadian, as his unsuccessful hunt for the Northwest Passage has become a treasured piece of Canadian historical lore. There are still places in Canada named after Martin Frobisher. Anyway, these commanders weren't really used to taking orders or operating alongside other commanders. But they knew how to handle their ships, and most importantly, they knew the English Channel. And that would ultimately make all the difference. You see, the English Channel is a notoriously challenging place to sail on the wrong day. But there are some things that can be relied on. The prevailing wind in the channel blows from the west to the east. This means that it's easiest to sail from west to east. If you wanted to move west once you were in the channel, on most days you were forced to tack against the wind. Now, for those in the crowd that don't sail, there's one thing that you need to understand here. The one place you cannot go in a sailboat is directly into the wind. Your sails will just flap around. Tacking is when you take a zigzag path towards the direction where the wind is coming from. As a result, sailing upwind is a much slower process than sailing downwind. On most days in the English Channel, the wind was coming from the west, so that meant moving west was slow and difficult. With that in mind, the English chose to station their fleet in Plymouth, which was the westernmost harbor in England that could accommodate all the ships. Now, this is important to understand because the fate of the Spanish Armada was basically decided by this basic fact of sailing. Okay, so now we're finally into it. Here's how this clash went down. When the Armada came in sight of England, their scouts told them that the English fleet was in Plymouth. And, fortuitously, an unfavorable tide meant that the English fleet was unable to leave harbor. So the admiral, the Duke of Medina Sidonia, held a council of war with his captains. Some of the Spanish captains advocated for attacking the English fleet in Plymouth while the tide kept them penned in. Now, here's the thing. If you're an armchair general, the Monday morning quarterbacks of the military history world, it's easy to say the Spanish really should have done this. The English would have been at their mercy. They could have potentially wrecked Queen Elizabeth's fleet right then and there, and then operated with impunity in the Channel. Why didn't they do it? Well, here's the thing. King Philip had given them orders to sail directly to Flanders for a rendezvous with the Duke of Parma. Timing was of the essence. If the Armada got bogged down in a fight at Plymouth Harbor, the timing of the whole thing might get blown. Also, it might be easy to imagine a Spanish blowout in this counterfactual, but that wasn't a given. The plan was only really worth it if the Spanish could destroy or severely damage most of the English fleet and sustain little damage themselves. Even with the tide in their favor, that wasn't a guarantee. So, the Duke of Medina Sidonia made the fateful decision to sail past Plymouth and keep heading east towards the Netherlands. Now, it's worth noting that the question of exactly where the Armada was supposed to rendezvous with the Duke of Parma was still up in the air, as there were few deep-water harbors suitable for the large ships of the Spanish Armada. The Duke of Parma was concentrating his army near the coastal town of Dunkirk. The original plan was for everyone to embark there. But while the Armada was in the Channel, Medina Sidonia changed the plan. Instead, he decided that they should rendezvous near the French town of Calais. Calais was just a better anchorage, and the admiral felt confident that both the Armada and the transports could be better defended there. Now, this might sound like nothing, but this was a huge change of plans. Moving nearly 20,000 troops and the needed transport boats some 50 kilometers down the coast was a huge undertaking. Not to mention the fact that Calais was technically French territory, and moving a giant army through a neutral country, or at least along the coast of a neutral country, came with its own complications. Permission needed to be granted, or at the very least, palms needed to be greased. With perfect communication, this last-minute change of plans likely still would have been a disaster. In this case, the Duke of Medina Sidonia hadn't heard from the Duke of Parma in weeks. He wasn't even sure if the Duke of Parma knew that the Armada had sailed from Spain. Even before a single shot had been fired, things were not looking good. But it was the Spanish admiral's decision to not engage the English in Plymouth Harbor that essentially settled the whole thing. By sailing east of Plymouth, the Armada gave what is known as the weather gauge to the English. During the Age of Sail, the weather gauge referred to being upwind of your enemy during a battle. Having the weather gauge meant that you could easily swoop down on your opponent and attack at will. If the enemy wanted to get to you, they would have to tack upwind. If you had the weather gauge, you set the terms of the battle. The prevailing winds in the channel meant that because the English kept to the west of the Spanish, they had the weather gauge the vast majority of the time. There were a few notable instances when the wind shifted and gave the Spanish the weather gauge, but these moments were relatively few. This is why the English did not lose a single ship in this encounter. They had the maritime equivalent of the high ground. I think this is one of the key reasons why the Spanish Armada maybe wasn't such a big deal. Once the Armada was east of Plymouth, all the engagements were either the English chasing and harassing a fleet on the move, or rearguard actions organized by the Spanish to occupy the English fleet while the rest of the Armada made a getaway. I would argue, and this is just my humble opinion, so take that for what it is, but it seems to me that given the Spanish inability to properly coordinate with the Duke of Parma, once the Armada was east of Plymouth and the English had the weather gauge, you've got a situation that's basically 5 moves until checkmate. Okay, let's take one more break, and when we come back, we'll break down exactly how this all played out. The first proper encounter between the English and Spanish fleets happened just east of Plymouth on July 31st. The English made the first move, as was dictated by the Code of Chivalry. You see, there'd been no official declaration of war between the two countries, but it was recognized that the Spanish were responding to English aggression. It would have been considered rude to make the Spanish shoot first and then make them look like the aggressors. Now, of course, all these little chivalric gestures could quickly be jettisoned if one side thought that they could get the edge on their opponents. But the fact that the Spanish had decided not to attack Plymouth put the English in a gracious mood. An opening shot was fired, and the Spanish responded by raising the flag on their flagship, making it clear which vessel was at the head of the fleet. Now the chase was on. The so-called Battle off Plymouth was really just a pursuit, with the English largely using the superior range of their guns to harass the Spanish from a distance. Now, in this encounter, the English didn't really do much damage to the Spanish fleet. The most notable events were strange, fluky accidents on the Spanish side. At one point, there was an unexplained explosion on one of the large Spanish galleons named the San Salvador. Given the location of the ship, this was almost certainly not caused by any English bombardment. It's been assumed that an unattended flame ignited the ship's store of gunpowder. The explosion was big enough to cripple the ship and kill roughly 100 sailors. In the ensuing attempt to aid the San Salvador and put out the fires, 2 of the fire brigade ships collided. One of these was a squadron flagship known as the Rosario. The Rosario's rudder was so badly damaged by the collision that it was forced to break away from the main body of the fleet and fend for itself in the channel as the Spanish Armada continued east. Now, the abandoned Rosario would really bring out the pirate in our guy Francis Drake. You see, he had been commanded by the Lord High Admiral to stay in formation and keep pursuing the Armada through the evening. But, A juicy Spanish squadron flagship with a broken rudder just floating in the channel all by its lonesome? I mean, no self-respecting pirate could resist. So that evening, in a flagrant disregard for his orders, Drake took his squadron and went hunting for the Rosario. They eventually caught up with it, forced a quick surrender, and plundered the ship for all that it was worth. Rumors would circulate for a long time that Drake lied about exactly how much booty he found on the ship so he could keep more of it for himself. Now, that might be a myth. I have been unable to confirm that. But of course, if you're going to make a pirate your vice admiral, you should probably expect some pirate shenanigans. Anyway, the running battle continued for the next 2 days. Having the weather gauge, the English were able to attempt more bombardments, but in those days, little damage was done to either fleet. The severely damaged San Salvador was eventually cut loose from the main body of the Armada, and it too was predictably collected and looted by the English. Things changed on August 2nd, when the Armada was off a small peninsula on the English coastline called the Portland Bill. On that day, the wind shifted, and for a few hours started blowing from east to west. This gave the Spanish the weather gauge for the first time during the encounter. So, the Spanish used the opportunity to attack the English fleet. But this was essentially a rearguard action. The main body of the Armada was kept as far east as possible. The attackers were a relatively small breakaway group who were trying to tie up the English and hopefully put enough of a hurt on them that some significant distance would open up between the English fleet and the main body of the Spanish Armada. This kind of worked. The English were tied up, but once again, the better English guns meant that the Spanish ships took more damage in the encounter. But still, no ships were lost, and all the damage was fairly minimal. The winds shifted again to the prevailing west to east direction, the Spanish broke off their attack, and once again, the chase was on. This chase would continue with bits of action here and there for the next 5 days. But on August 7th, the Armada was in sight of Calais. The Spanish had managed to sail the length of the English Channel. They had lost 2 ships, but that had been because of a fluky accident. The English hadn't done much to hurt the Spanish fleet. But by the same token, the mighty Spanish Armada had done even less to the English. The Armada had reached Calais, but the Duke of Medina Sidonia still had not heard anything from the Duke of Parma. The army of Flanders was still, presumably, in Dunkirk. Medina Sidonia wasn't even sure if the Duke of Parma knew about the change of plans and the new rendezvous point. So now the Armada was forced to sit there in hostile waters and wait to get a letter from the Duke of Parma. This was not ideal. But it was determined that Calais was still the safest anchorage in the region. So the Armada formed up into a defensive formation, dropped anchor, and waited. When word finally did come, they learned that Parma was still at his headquarters in Bruges. On top of that, a small Dutch fleet was blockading the harbor of Dunkirk. This meant that those transport vessels, which were supposed to take the Army of Flanders all the way to England, were unable to get out of that port. Now, it would likely take the Duke of Parma a day, maybe even 2 days, to get his army and all his transports to Calais using inland waterways. Again, this was not ideal. For any of this to work, the Duke of Parma needed to be ready to go. He was not ready to go. This is when the English pulled off one of their most clever and most celebrated maneuvers in the whole campaign. That night, while both fleets were anchored off the French coast, An English captain named Sir William Winter suggested to the Lord High Admiral that they use fire ships to disrupt the Spanish anchorage. The admiral loved the idea. The plan was very simple. 8 large, but relatively expendable English ships would be loaded with flammable material. A skeleton crew would pilot these ships by night towards the anchored Spanish fleet. When they were close enough, the wheels or tillers would be tied and the ships would be set on fire. Then the small crews would escape on rowboats that were being towed behind. The flaming ships would then continue on their path right into the center of the Spanish Armada. The plan worked perfectly. Now, it should be noted that these were not exploding fire ships, as were sometimes used in this period. They were just big ships on fire. But the Spanish didn't know that. When they saw the flaming ships coming towards the fleet, they had to assume that they might be rigged to explode. Medina Sidonia had no choice but to order his fleet to hastily cut anchor and evade the incoming fire ships. Now, this moment became a favorite of artists creating paintings for a patriotic English audience. The best known is a 1796 painting by Philip James de Loutherbourg called The Defeat of the Spanish Armada. In it, the fire ships are shown dramatically ripping through the Spanish Armada and setting much of it on fire. The not-so-subtle implication being that the English fire ships destroyed the Armada, or at least damaged the fleet beyond repair. This is a total myth. In truth, not a single Spanish ship was damaged because of contact with the fire ships. One Spanish ship did break its rudder when it collided with another Spanish vessel during the escape, but that was it. Now, that's not to say that the fire ships weren't effective. They were, but just in a considerably less dramatic and fun-to-paint way. The fire ships temporarily divided the Spanish fleet and sent it into disarray, although, to the credit of the Spanish, they were able to form up into a defensive formation once again after a few hours. More significantly, to escape the fire ships, the Spanish had to hastily cut their anchors. This meant that almost every ship in the fleet lost its best, heaviest anchor. The other anchors they were carrying were simply not substantial enough to keep the fleet in place at any of the anchorages along the French or Dutch coast. You simply could not embark the thousands of soldiers that were on board these ships and land them in England without good anchors. They were essential. So, that was it. The Spanish plan had always had very poor odds of success. Once the anchors were gone, those odds were reduced to practically zero. After the fire ship attack, the Duke of Medina Sidonia now had only one main goal: save the Spanish Armada so it could fight another day. This leads us to the biggest battle of this entire engagement. This was known as the Battle off Gravelines, so named for the part of the European coast known as the Gravelines, just northeast of Calais. But this fight was essentially another rearguard action, with the Duke of Medina Sidonia and a hard core of the best Spanish warships doing their best to tie up the English, while the main body of the Armada tried to make an escape to the north. Once again, the English had the weather gauge. A small group of 5 Spanish galleons, led by the Duke of Medina Sidonia, made a frankly courageous stand, holding off the English for many hours so that the rest of the Spanish Armada could try and outrun the attackers. This ultimately proved somewhat futile. The English fleet caught up with the main body of the Armada and, using the naval high ground that is the weather gauge, proceeded to batter the fleet until they ran out of ammunition. But here's the thing. The Spanish kept it together. Now, don't get me wrong. The fleet took some serious damage, especially the galleons that had been tasked with leading the rearguard defense. But only one Spanish ship was sunk by the English that day. 2 more were incapacitated and drifted to shore where they were captured by Dutch rebels. But that was it. The famous Battle off the Gravelines led to the loss of 3 Spanish ships. 3! This is another reason why maybe the Spanish Armada wasn't such a big deal. As far as naval encounters go, the battle off Gravelines was kind of small potatoes. The Spanish weren't seriously attempting to destroy the English fleet. They were just attempting to get away with most of the Armada intact. For context, at the Battle of Lepanto a decade and a half earlier, the Spanish-led forces destroyed 50 ships and captured around 140 others. At the Battle of Ponta Delgada in the Azores in 1580, the Spanish had destroyed or captured 11 ships and killed 1,000 enemy soldiers and sailors. While they were engaged with the English fleet, the Spanish Armada lost 6 ships, and 3 of those were because of accidents and collisions that had nothing to do with the English guns. But famously, of those 130 ships that sailed from Lisbon, only around 65 made it back to the Iberian Peninsula. So, what happened? Well, by far the worst part of the English enterprise from the Spanish perspective was the long and deadly voyage home. The battle off Gravelines ended with the English out of ammunition and gunpowder. The Armada then turned north and made a run for it. There would be no rendezvousing with the Duke of Parma. The invasion was canceled, at least for now. Now, without context, it seems absolutely crazy and counterintuitive that the Spanish commanders chose to bring the fleet home by sailing north around the north coast of Scotland and then down past the west coast of Ireland. Why would they take the longest, coldest way home possible? The answer, once again, has to do with those prevailing winds. Trying to head southwest, back the way that the Armada had come, would have been a suicide mission. The Spanish would have been tacking into the wind the whole way. Not only would that have been incredibly slow, but it would have been the equivalent of charging uphill at the better positioned English fleet. The northern route was really the only choice. But it was this treacherous road home that ultimately turned the 1588 voyage of the Spanish Armada from an overly ambitious swing and a miss into a disaster. The English fleet pursued the Armada as far north as the Scottish border, but then broke off as the weather turned increasingly cold, foggy, and generally nasty. The Spanish kept heading north, and that's when the storms began. Gales and unfavorable winds scattered the fleet north of Scotland, blowing some ships so far off course that they were getting close to the shores of Norway. The ships that had been brought from the warm and relatively calm Mediterranean and the bulky transport hulks fared the worst in these cold and stormy seas. Soon, many ships were starting to come apart at the seams. A number sank off the north coast of Scotland. The men aboard the ships were doing even worse. Many had been injured in the fighting, and now food was running low and disease was starting to run rampant aboard these cramped ships. While off the coast of Scotland, one Spanish sailor sadly reflected on just how badly things had gone for the Armada, writing, quote, "We all thought we would emerge rich from this campaign, but after what has happened, we shall leave it with only the shirts on our backs." End quote. Still, the Armada managed to round the tip of Scotland with 112 ships still sailing. But as they turned south and headed home via the west coast of Ireland, another set of gales whipped up and thrashed the already weather-beaten fleet. The fleet was driven towards Ireland, where many ships chose to make landfall to hopefully secure supplies. We know that in these storms, between 17 and 24 ships were sunk or were run ashore on the west coast of Ireland. The marooned Spanish sailors were then hunted and summarily executed by the occupying English forces. These occupying English were especially worried that the Spanish survivors might whip up dissent among the Irish Catholics. Now, apparently, there are legends in Ireland about these marooned castaways from the Spanish Armada. There are rumors that some of these Spaniards managed to evade detection and were harbored by sympathetic Irish locals who had no love for the occupying English. Legend has it that some of the Spanish sailors chose to stay in Ireland and even fathered children. Genealogical studies have not been able to confirm these stories, but who knows? If there were Spanish survivors who stayed in Ireland, they were so few, or kept it so low-key, that they didn't really make an impression in the historical record. It's been guessed that roughly 6,000 Spanish soldiers and sailors died somewhere along the Irish coast. In the end, around 65 ships of the original 130 arrived back in Spain. Experts will quibble over these numbers, as the primary sources can be a little unclear about which ships returned and which ships were lost. Some claim that as many as 80 ships made it back to Spain. The historian Angus Constam provides a ship-by-ship accounting in his popular history of the Armada, and he is confidently able to place 64 ships back in Spain at the end of the voyage, with 3 other ships as potential survivors. This is also supported by the research of the historian Robert Hutchison, who feels confident that likely 66 ships returned to Spain. So, I think it's safe to say that the Spanish Armada was cut in half by this voyage. But notably, it wasn't destroyed. Also, contemporary opinion, even in England, had been that while the English fleet had performed well, it was ultimately the violent storms that had crippled the Armada and saved England. Queen Elizabeth's post-Armada propaganda was all about how God had intervened and kept the Spanish at bay. The English fleet was given second billing to what the Queen called a, quote, Protestant wind that defeated the Armada. We know that the Dutch cast medals commemorating the defeat of the Armada, which bore a Latin inscription that translated to, quote, God blew his winds and they were scattered, end quote. Even Phillip II allegedly said, quote, I sent the Armada against men, not God's winds and waves, end quote. Now, to be honest, that's one of those historical quotes that seems a little too perfect. I actually went hunting to see if any historians thought that that quote might be made up. I didn't come across anything, so, take that for what it is. Still, the experts all seem to agree that contemporary opinion in 1588 was that the weather had been the main factor in the Spanish defeat. It would take nearly a century for a patriotic myth about English naval heroism and the devastating fire ships to firmly take root. 2 centuries later, it would be that myth that was being represented in the heroic paintings commemorating the event. The whole thing had been an embarrassing and expensive failure for the Spanish, but it didn't break them. The Anglo-Spanish War continued for another 18 years. As mentioned in the introduction, the next year the English would have their own disastrous Armada moment. The English Armada would prove to be just as costly and embarrassing a disaster as the Spanish precursor. In the 1590s, the Spanish kingdom would manage to build two other giant fleets, usually called the Second and Third Spanish Armadas. But these fleets were also doomed to failure, largely thanks to ocean storms. When the Anglo-Spanish War was finally concluded in 1604, both sides had scored some notable victories and had been dealt some brutal defeats. The final treaty restored what was known as status quo antebellum, that is, the situation before the war. The English agreed to end their overt support of the Dutch rebels. Spanish and English merchants were permitted to enter each other's ports, and English ports could even be used by Spanish warships attacking the Netherlands. State-sponsored piracy was to end. But the Spanish agreed to stop meddling in English religious affairs and recognized the growing English colonial holdings in North America. So, was the Spanish Armada really a big deal? Well, based on my reading, I'm going to say it was not nearly as big a deal as the Victorian and New Elizabethan historians would have us believe. Let's review, shall we? First, the Spanish invasion plan was deeply flawed from its conception. The chances of success were always minimal, and all the major Spanish commanders were on record saying that before the Armada ever set sail. Even if the Spanish had caught every bounce, defied the odds, and pulled off the invasion, the war aims were not as apocalyptic as the more jingoistic histories would suggest. The Spanish wanted a quick treaty that would get the English out of the Netherlands, the pirates out of the Caribbean, and would guarantee rights for English Catholics. Philip probably would not have even deposed Queen Elizabeth. The actual campaign was over before it started. As soon as the Spanish gave the English the weather gauge, the chances of success plummeted. The fact that the commanders of the Armada couldn't properly communicate with the land forces while they were trying to coordinate a ridiculously complex amphibious operation doomed them. The actual fighting between the fleets was minimal when compared to the other great naval clashes of the era. Most of the battles were either chases or rearguard actions meant to help the main body of the Spanish Armada get away. The weather did more to ultimately cripple the Spanish Armada than any English ordnance. Finally, in the short term, the Spanish Armada of 1588 didn't really settle anything. Not only did the Spanish live to fight another day, the Spanish Empire remained the preeminent power in Europe well into the next century. The Anglo-Spanish War kept going for another 16 years after the Spanish Armada, and it was fought to a stalemate. I think you need to squint pretty hard at the historical record to argue, like all those Victorian historians that I quoted in part 1, that the Spanish Armada was a decisive and pivotal historical event. With 300 or 400 years of perspective, it might seem like the defeat of the Spanish Armada presaged the decline of the Spanish Empire and the rise of the British Empire. But to make the argument that 1588 was the turning point, I think you need to ignore the next century's worth of history. Over the course of the 17th century, both the Spanish and English kingdoms would have many peaks and valleys. Spain's decline as the preeminent European power was a long process, brought on by a myriad of social, economic, and political factors that we don't really have time to fully unpack here. You could argue that 1588 represented the apex of Spanish power, but the immediate aftermath of the Armada did not trigger an irreversible slide into irrelevance. It would take another solid century's worth of expensive wars, a steadily shrinking supply of looted treasure from the Americas, systemic waste and corruption, and increasingly incompetent and sometimes severely disabled Habsburg monarchs before Spain had been thoroughly eclipsed by her European rivals. But at the end of the Anglo-Spanish War in 1604, Spain was still arguably the team to beat in Europe. England famously had an incredibly rocky 17th century. It was torn apart by a brutal civil war in the 1640s. It's not like England defeated the Armada and then marched off unimpeded towards world empire. The English had to endure more than one political revolution before they were able to emerge as a fledgling hegemon in the 18th century. In other words, they still needed to pass through some fire. Now, to be clear, I'm not saying that the attempted invasion of England in 1588 wasn't an important historical event. It was. And as I've hopefully shown, the story of the Armada is super interesting. But it's been allowed to overshadow countless other historical events from the same period that were arguably just as, if not more, important. But that's probably because the event lends itself well to myth-making. It's a story filled with excitement, high stakes, and colorful characters. But remember, a good story isn't always good history. Okay, that's all for this week. Join us again in 2 weeks' time for the 200th episode of Our Fake History. You might have noticed that today's episode went a little long. Well, that's because I had to wrap this series up before episode 200. You know, that's how it goes when you're making these shows. Before we go this week, I need to give a special shout out to the following people. Big ups to Jay, to Megan O'Donnell, to Desi Rose, to Dawn Watts, to Kayla Wilcox, to Chris Sodoma, to Rebecca, to Ralph Moisa, and to Michael Beach. All of these folks have decided to pledge at $5 or more every month on Patreon, so you know what that means. They are beautiful human beings. Thank you again to everyone who supports this podcast at all the different levels. If you want to get some Our Fake History merch, we're talking t-shirts, hoodies, tote bags, whatever, go to the TeePublic store. The easiest way to get there is to go to ourfakehistory.com and follow the links. If you are still interested in participating in the 200th episode call-in show, then please send me a voice memo at ourfakehistory@gmail.com or call the toll-free number at 1-800-397-0870. I'll be taking messages until March 25th. So if you want to participate, get your call in soon. If you want to get in touch with me in the meantime, you can always send me an email at ourfakehistory@gmail.com. Hit me up on Facebook, facebook.com/ourfakehistory. Find me on Twitter at ourfakehistory. Find me on Instagram at ourfakehistory. Find me on TikTok at ourfakehistory. And don't be afraid to check out the Our Fake History YouTube channel by going to YouTube and searching for, you guessed it, Our Fake History. As always, the theme music for the show comes to us from Dirty Church. Check out more from Dirty Church at dirtychurch.bandcamp.com. And all the other music you heard on the show today was written and recorded by me. My name is Sebastian Major. And remember, just because it didn't happen doesn't mean it isn't real.